Okay, so today I'm going to talk about this automation I built for one of my clients. It's a huge time saver for my client who wanted to go to a US conference for the first time in a new industry and had no idea who to talk to because they were very new to the industry. And so this automation saved them hundreds of hours of manual work that they would have done originally to look at company websites, look at all the different attendees' LinkedIns, and figure out who to even talk to ahead of the conference. What made it worse was that they only had about 2 weeks before the conference, so we had a very limited amount of time. And so this is what I built for them. I built them an automation using a visual builder called n8n and created a system that pulls everything you need to know about an attendee automatically. Whether it's to scrape their company website, it's to pull recent news for the past 6 months, or even look at their LinkedIn to see if they're a relevant individual they should be talking to. And here's a kicker. I also use Claude as a way to automatically tier the people that were coming to the conference to see who were the most value add people that the client should be talking to during the conference. What's cool about this is that I did not manually go through any of these companies' websites or information. I created an automation using that visual builder called n8n and automatically created these workflows that ran while I was asleep. And so by the time the conference came around, the client had a 300-page briefing document that had all of the information they need to know about their most high priority targets, tiered with the help of LLMs and other information like recent news. And so they were able to spend that time super effectively and set up meetings that resulted in potential revenue opportunities down the line. So let me walk you guys through how I thought about the architecture and pull it for yourself so that you can build your own systems. So let me walk you guys through what I built for my client. Essentially, what I wanted to build was a conference intelligence system that automatically pulled information about all the attendees that were coming, enriched it with more relevant information, and digested it in a way that the client can look at very quickly and figure out whether they want to talk to this person or not at the conference. And so here's what we started with. We started with a Google Sheet with very simple information about each of the 700, 800 attendees that were coming. As you can see, it's basically just name, employer, and title. And from here, the normal workflow would have been to go into Google, look up these people, look up these companies, go to their website, and look up their news and figure out what information that's relevant for my client, put it into a Google Doc, and maybe digest it later and make sure that it's actually the right information. And ultimately, I think the biggest thing was that it would have been inconsistent for each of these because it depends on which news source that I'm looking at each time. Maybe I'm taking a different approach depending on who they are. Maybe there's not as many information available. And so at the end of the day, it would have been something that would have been a lot harder for my client to look at quickly and figure out what's the right information. So here's what I built for them. This is basically an overview of the conference intelligence system that I built, which creates an automated system that uses the same methodology each time to pull the right information about the attendees and puts additional information that's relevant, whether they are participating in the data center industry that we were talking about, whether there's any touch points that we should bring about during a conversation, and ultimately score them in a way that helps the client figure out who they need to talk to as a priority. So here's the start of the input. We had that Google spreadsheet, had very basic information. So in order to make it a lot more interesting and relevant, I connected it to a bunch of different APIs using n8n workflow, which I'll go into more detail soon. That's the meat of this video. But basically, these APIs play the role of connecting to other existing software apps out there and pulling relevant information based on some criteria, some filters I put in there, so that the database gets updated with relevant information. I connected to Perplexity API, which creates a connection to the web search and pull relevant information about each of these companies. So here I pulled very basic information. I looked at company website, I pulled company employee size, headquarter, revenue, all the basic stuff that you want to know about a company without having to do that manual search on Google or something like Crunchbase. After that, I focused on the people side. So using Apollo API, which is another API that connects to the database that Apollo team manages around basic contact information, LinkedIn, job history, anything to enrich the data of potential people that you're talking to. And so by connecting to this, I was able to pull LinkedIn URLs, I was able to pull job history, how senior these people are, whether they were decision makers, and it really ultimately helped to make better decisions. Finally, I connected to another API called Tavly, which is a news source API. And using that, I searched for the most recent 6 months news based on key criteria, key terminology, such as data centers, M&A, projects, anything that was relevant for our client. From there, this is where it gets really interesting. I created another workflow that plugs into an LLM. Here I'm using Claude because I think it's one of the best tools to use to digest a lot of different information and disseminate it in a way that really helps the client. Using this Claude LLM, I was able to summarize everything that we pulled from the different APIs in simple 2-3 sentences that is most relevant, whether it's the most recent news, whether it's how relevant they are. And ultimately, I used a scoring rubric, which I'll get into in a bit, to tier these individuals in a manner that prioritizes the individuals that would create the most value for the client so that they can go out and secure $1 million contracts after these conversations. Here are the 3 outputs that I produced. The first one is Airtable, which was a central repository that contains all of the individual data that we started with, but populating it with all the enriched data that we got from the different APIs. Also has a summary from the LLMs that was plugged in as well, and then ultimately created a central repository that the client can quickly look through on their phone to be able to pull relevant information. On top of that, I created a few other documents that the client can also look at pretty quickly. So the next was a 300-page briefing document that basically consolidates everything into 1 to 2 pages per high priority target. And from there, also adds a lot more information. What are the top talking points? What are the top news? Anything that was relevant for the client to look at very quickly. Finally, I also created about a 50-60 page industry report that helped the client really get up to speed based on all the information that I pulled across all these different APIs and LLMs about the industry and what they're looking into. Who are the main competitors in the industry? What are the main investment thesis to think about? What are some risk areas and regulatory concerns? And so all of these combine into a quick industry report that I'm happy to build another video for in the future. So here's the outcome. Of the 700 plus attendees that we were looking at, we were able to figure out who the top 73 priority targets were. And all of this took about 3 days to complete. And the actual automations running in the background only takes a few hours at most. The bulk of this time was spent figuring out the logic, figuring out the output, and seeing if that was the output that the client could really use and was helpful to them, and adjusting that logic so that the final output would be a meaningful impact to the client. And so I'm happy to go into this in more detail. So I showed you guys the intelligence system that I built, but how did I actually build it? This is the tool that I actually use to create all of the backbone of the intelligence system. It's a tool called n8n. It's a software that's readily available, and it's basically a way to create automations that run for the logical workflow that you want to build it and produces the data and outcome that you want it to produce. And the way to think about n8n is that it's essentially a visual workflow builder where you drag these nodes, connect them together, and data flows from one to the next. And essentially, you're creating this logic of what to do in each step that finally results in an outcome that's ready to put into the database or whatever else you want to create at the end of the day. n8n is as easy as you want it to be. You can essentially just use the nodes that are readily available, and they're already plugged into the integrations you want, like to Airtable, to Google Sheets, to Gmail. Whatever tool you want to use is already plugged in, so it's very easy to build these workflows. However, there's also added flexibility if you wanted to make it a little bit more complex. For example, you can add these code nodes to parse the data and create data in a way that is shaped into the final format, as in connect them together and data flows from one to the next. And essentially, you're creating this logic of what to do in each step that finally results in an outcome that's ready to put into the database or whatever else you want to create at the end of the day. n8n is as easy as you want it to be. You can essentially just use the nodes that are readily available, and they're already plugged into the integrations you want, like to Airtable, to Google Sheets, to Gmail. Whatever tool you want to use is already plugged in, so it's very easy to build these workflows. However, there's also added flexibility if you wanted to make it a little bit more complex. For example, you can add these code nodes to parse the data and create data in a way that is shaped into the final format, as in if you wanted to fit into a certain column in the Airtable, you're able to massage the data in a way that makes sense for you. So one last thing that's also pretty interesting is that for each of these nodes, you can run just that individual node to see what the input turns into as an output. So you can debug it as soon as you want. You look at the output and you're like, hey, here's the way I want it to look. This is not exactly how it is. how do I go about changing that? And that's when you play around with the different settings, different filters. If you need, you might want to put a code node in between to make sure that you're getting the outcome you want. So I'm basically using this logic to plug into the different APIs I mentioned in the intelligence system. It's essentially the same workflow for Perplexity, for Apollo, for Tavly, just with a little bit of different logic layered in each. So let me walk you through at least one of them to give you a flavor of what it looks like. So this is plugging into the database that we were looking at earlier, but populating individual information about company websites, company description, headquarter revenue, using this API called Perplexity. And so the way it works through is that there's a scheduled trigger here, which means every designated time, like 5 minutes, I want this workflow to run. It pulls all the starting information that I need, which is basically the attendee information and the company information from the database. From there, I'm connecting it to an API for Perplexity, where I've added filters of what information I'm looking for exactly. Like I said, it's the company website, headquarter information, revenue information, very simple, basic stuff, and then pulls it all in a huge database. So I wanted to actually have a code node here so that it breaks up the different chunks of the data so that it can populate the right columns in the Airtable. Here's the output. As you can see, this is a company information. It automatically pulls this website, this description, which is pretty easy to see, headquarter location, employee size, revenue, all just by running this workflow multiple times. And what's great is I just plug this in, keep it on, and it keeps automating on its own so that it can populate the empty fields for all the records that we have in the database. Using the same logic, I'm building the same workflow for Apollo, which is again the API I use to populate people information like LinkedIn, job history. I'm also using it for connecting it to recent news API called Tavly, and I added a few filter words in there to make sure that we're pulling relevant news for the past 6 months for each of these companies, whether they're related to the data center industry or they're working on live construction projects. I'm planning on creating some future videos where I'm going to do deep dives on each of these APIs, how to set them up, what are the nodes that are required, how to make sure you have rate limits in there so that you're not overusing your APIs, which cost a little bit of money, and other gotchas that will cost you hours if you don't know them. So coming soon on these videos. Once we have all these enriched data flowing through the Airtable, this is the next layer, that intelligence layer that I was talking about when we were walking through the architecture. So the first part is that I built a scoring rubric, which I'm going to walk through here, basically tiering the attendees that are coming to the conference and breaking them out into 3 major groups. One of them being potential partners for the client, potential end users, and potential competitors that we could use actually to get more information about the industry. And so based on that categorization, which the automation does automatically, I'm also scoring them based on a rubric that I've laid out here. And based on that rubric, it tiers and provides a relevant score between 1 to 10 of each of these companies that are coming to the conference so that the client knows who are the most high priority targets to talk to. And this is how I was able to get from 800 different attendees that are coming to 73 high priority targets based on this scoring rubric. And then based on that rubric, I was able to build an AI prompt using this workflow in n8n, connected to the Claude API here, which again is done in the same way that we did for Tavly API or Perplexity API. And then, so after the scoring is done on the individual companies, now I'm using Claude to do 3 things. First one being summarize all of the company information that we've collected through the different APIs, but in a way where it's summarized into 1 or 2 paragraphs so that's easy for the client to see. After that, it also summarizes the recent news that we pulled together, which has links attached to each of these news articles that we can look through, but also summarizing it in about 2 to 3 sentences so that it's easy to follow. Finally, it also uses that scoring rubric to prioritize the clients based on a scoring framework of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest priority, and summarizes that with a rationale of why they're high priority, whether it's because they're working on live construction projects that's relevant for the client, or they're in the geographic location that the client might be looking at, or they're the right size or right employee base that we're looking for. So after all of those workflows go through, this is the final output. As you can see, this is the Airtable that we were looking at where it provided additional information about the companies, but here's a component that Claude did. So based on the 3 tiers that we talked about, A being partners, for example, it's tiered them into a priority score between 1 to 10, 10 being the highest. And based on that, it also provides a priority rationale of why this company is a right high priority target for us. And then, as I mentioned before, here's the recent news summary, which again distills all the information that we collected through the Tavily API into about 2-3 sentences, which provides only the most relevant information from the past 6 months that the client needs to look at. So they don't need to click every single one of the 10 links that exist, but can just look at this recent news summary. And if they want to learn more, that's when they click into the links. So based on all the data that exists in this Airtable, I also created a workflow that automatically created this company brief. So based on all the data that was populated in the Airtable, I also built another workflow that automatically populated this Google Doc with all the information that we just produced into a company brief. So this is about 300 pages looking through the 73 high priority targets. And for each one of them, it's producing all the stuff that we talked about. So based on all the data that was populated in the Airtable, I also built another workflow that automatically populated this Google Doc with all the information that we just produced into a company brief. So this is about 300 pages looking through the 73 high priority targets. And for each one of them, it's producing all the stuff that we talked about, the rationale of why they're high priority, all the basic company information that already exists in the database, but now they can just look at this Google Doc. Recent news summary we just talked about, and different components of why they're the right relevant people to talk to. And then here's the most interesting part. I've also layered in logic so that it lays out which questions to ask as conversation starters for these attendees when they meet at the conference. And so all of these are populated by the data that we produced. So it knows to ask questions about new hirings that they're doing, or new projects that they're working on, partnerships that they're looking for, follow-ups that they want to have, or even more importantly, cautionary flags of what not to talk to them about based on the information that we pulled together. And then, as I mentioned before, here are all the links that we pulled from Tavily. So if you want to learn more, you can just go into these links and figure out more relevant details. So the final output I created for my client is an industry report I pulled together using AI sources like the workflow automation walked you through in n8n, also using other tools like Google's Notebook LM, and building together this report within maybe 10 to 15 hours. And it basically distills all the critical information you want to have in advance of going to the conference, and basically created an opportunity for the team to be well prepared for the conversations that we're going to have. It basically provides an industry overview of the data center market they're trying to enter. What are the most important aspects of the industry you want to know in advance? What does the market size look like? What does the growth rate look like? Who are the main players in the system? And what do they do? What do they offer? As well as walking through all the individual technologies that these companies are working on today, and even providing a market entry recommendation that creates an opportunity for the client to understand how to think about their market entry strategy and knowing what questions to ask when they're at the conference talking to the right partners or potential end users. This is another great thing that you can create using AI tools too. My client was super happy about all of these different outputs. And let me just walk you through the results again. So after going through all these workflows, automations, I was able to go through over 700 attendees with very basic information, enriching it with more relevant information that the client could use to build some intelligence ahead of the conference, and had key outputs that they could use to understand what conversations to have with these attendees, understand the industry a lot better, and even knowing how to even start the conversations with these people. So it saved them hundreds of hours and allowed them to really focus in on the most important components of the conference. And so here's the thing, the system does not disappear after one event. We could use all the workflows that we created here and plug it into the next conference, next trade show, next big event for the company, and just make sure that we're tweaking the logic, making sure we understand what output we want to produce at the end of the day. Basically have a reusable template that can plug and play and save tons of time and energy and resources for the client. If you want to build this yourself, I'm going to release individual tutorial videos about each of the components I walk through, whether that's how to use n8n, how to plug into APIs, how to use LLMs to make sure that you have an intelligence layer that automatically summarizes the key information that you're looking for, scores and tiers of attendees to make sure that you know who you should be prioritizing to talk to, and anything else that I brought up today. So subscribe and follow so that you don't miss the videos that are coming out. And if you have any specific needs or questions you want to talk through in more detail, I have a link to my website in the description below. So definitely check it out and let me know if you want to talk. Otherwise, leave any comments about any questions, thoughts. If there's any use cases you think of and you want to partner together, let me know. I'm happy to pull it together. Thanks for listening to the end and see you in the next one.